Hi everyone, I'm Andy, and this is the AI Breakdown. Welcome to your weekly news edition, where I'll cover what happened in AI last week and why it matters. A few weeks back, we were talking about an Anthropic round that was still rumour and market gossip. Well, that story has now arrived properly, and then some. On the 28th of May, Anthropic announced a $65 billion Series H at a $965 billion post-money valuation. That's not just a big round, it's Anthropic overtaking OpenAI to become the most valuable private AI company out there. And it did it while confirming it has confidentially filed a draft S1 with the SEC to go public. The investor list tells its own story. Yes, you've got the usual late-stage names in there: Altimeter, Dragoneer, Green Oaks, Sequoia, Capital Group, Coatue, GIC, Iconic, and plenty more. The round also folded in $15 billion of previously committed hyperscaler money, including $5 billion from Amazon, which gives you a sense of how unusual the capital stack already is. But the bit I'd pay attention to is the strategic supply chain angle. To me, that's the giveaway that frontier AI is leaving the software era and entering the industrial era. Anthropic also brought in Micron, Samsung, and SK Hynix. When memory makers want equity exposure, you're locking up scarce inputs the way old world industry locked up oil, rail, or fabs. That matters because this Anthropic securing position around memory and HBM supply. When chip and memory suppliers want a seat at the table, it tells you the frontier model market is maturing into something more like heavy industry than software as we used to know it. Anthropic says its run rate revenue crossed $47 billion earlier in May, up from about $9 billion at the end of 2025. Optimists will look at that and say this is exactly what scale looks like. Pessimists will point out fairly that run rate revenue isn't the same thing as profit, and frontier AI still eats capital quickly. Both points can be true, but for anyone actually buying the stuff inside a large business, the practical read is simpler. Vendor risk anxiety drops when your supplier has a near $1 trillion valuation, a giant cash cushion, and a path to public markets. And this is where it gets interesting for CIOs and procurement teams. If Anthropic and OpenAI both end up listing in roughly the same window, we'll get financial disclosure we simply haven't had before. Real disclosure, gross margins, customer concentration, compute spend, how ugly or healthy the economics really are. And whilst the near trillion number is eye-catching, for sure, the genuinely useful thing for enterprise buyers is that the black box around the model layer may finally crack open a bit, and once that happens, partner selection gets a lot less theological and a lot more grounded. With that context, let's shift focus to the next story, which falls in the same category of massive funding, but has quite a distinct impact. On the 27th of May, Cognition announced it had raised more than $1 billion at a $26 billion post-money valuation. This is the company behind Devin, and since last year, the owner of the Windsurf IDE. But the number that really grabbed people was not the valuation. It was Cognition's claim that 89% of the code committed by its own engineers is now committed by Devin, with the rest coming from local agents in Windsurf. Now, I'd treat that number carefully. 90-ish% of commits written by AI is not the same thing as saying 90% of engineering value has been automated. Commits are an imperfect proxy. Anyone who's ever inherited a messy codebase knows volume and value are not close cousins. But even if that figure is directionally right rather than perfectly precise, it still shifts the conversation. For me, the real debate is whether autonomous coding is actually production ready at scale. For the last year, most engineering leaders have been asking whether AI coding tools make developers a bit faster. Cognition is trying to move the frame entirely. The pitch is no longer assistant economics. It's self-driving software. How much of the backlog can run with minimal human intervention? How much of the routine implementation work can be handed off? And if that's where this market is going, then the risk to seat-based tools like Copilot or Cursor is obvious. They start to look like a transitional layer between human-first development and agent-first development. My own view is that engineering leaders shouldn't get hypnotized by the 89% figure itself. I'd focus on the more boring questions instead. We already know AI can write a lot of code fast, The question is whether it can do that in a way that leaves teams with better software, not just more software. That means less review debt, fewer security surprises, and cleaner architecture. Now, as we continue with infrastructure, but moving from software to steel and substations, we should highlight another major investment. On the 30th of May, at President Macron's Choose France summit, SoftBank confirmed it will invest up to 75 billion euros to build AI data centers in France. That's its largest European AI venture so far, and its biggest infrastructure bet outside the US. The first phase is 45 billion euros across sites in Dunkirk, Bosquel, and Bouchain, with a target of 3.1 gigawatts in the Hauts-de-France region by 2031. The full plan goes up to 5 gigawatts. To put that in context, we're well past the point where these are just warehouses with some very expensive racks in them. This is national-scale infrastructure. SoftBank is also working with Schneider Electric on data center enclosure manufacturing in Dunkirk, with Schneider handling power modules and with EDF on power at the Bouchain site. So this is more than just a money story. It's a power story, a supply chain story, and a sovereignty story all at once. Fortune had the useful framing here. This wasn't some vague memorandum tucked away in the small print. Masayoshi Son announced it at the summit itself, alongside Emmanuel Macron, which tells you how politically legible this has become. France isn't just trying to attract startups or research labs, it's trying to attract the physical base layer of AI. Why does that matter? Because Europe has spent the last 2 years worrying, with some justification, that the future of AI would be rented from American hyperscalers and governed somewhere else. Putting that much compute on French soil, partly backed by EDF's nuclear fleet, is a direct attempt to change the balance. My read is that this is one of those stories that sounds like infrastructure policy until you realize it's really procurement policy in disguise. In AI, whoever owns the steel and the substations gets a big say in who gets to buy with confidence. That's why this matters. It's not just about building data centers in France. It's about changing who has leverage when regulated buyers start asking where the compute lives and who controls it. If Europe gets serious domestic capacity, then buyers in regulated industries get more leverage and more optionality. The caveat, obviously, is that up to 75 billion euros means exactly that. The firmly committed bit is the first tranche. But even with that caveat, this is a very big marker for where European AI autonomy is heading. Reflecting on that sovereignty theme, let's turn to regulation, where a significant update has emerged. A few weeks back, the line on the EU AI Act was that the omnibus talks had collapsed and the August 2026 deadline for high-risk systems was going to hold. That is no longer the picture. Agreement was reached on the 7th of May, and by late May the shape of the deal had become clear. The big change is timeline relief. Obligations for Annex 3 high-risk systems move from the 2nd of August 2026 to the 2nd of December 2027. That's a 16-month deferral. Annex 1 product-regulated obligations slip from August 2027 to August 2028, and the sandbox mandate is delayed as well. The Council said the aim was to simplify and streamline the rules, which tells you how Brussels wants this taken. If you're running compliance or product teams, that buys you breathing room. And honestly, that's probably a good thing. Bad compliance deadlines create box-ticking theatre, not safer systems. I'd rather see companies use the extra time to do the hard operational work properly than rush out policies nobody believes. So budgets and engineering time that were being lined up for documentation, conformity assessments, and internal process work don't disappear, but the pressure eases. Law firm and policy commentary through late May was broadly welcoming on that point, even if digital rights groups warned the delay could weaken protections. Vendors selling AI Act compliance tooling on pure deadline panic will be feeling a bit less cheerful this week. But this isn't a simple softening story. The same package adds new prohibitions from the 2nd of December 2026, including bans on using AI to generate non-consensual intimate imagery and child sexual abuse material, extending explicitly to nudifier apps. So the process obligations get pushed back, but the red lines get sharper. For me, this is basically the most business-like outcome Europe could have landed on. Less panic around the heavy compliance machinery more clarity around things nobody wants to defend anyway. If you're a CIO, I'd read this as permission to slow down the paperwork scramble, not permission to get sloppy. And if you've got image generation features anywhere in the stack, the new prohibitions are the bit to pay attention to now. Speaking of gradual shifts, let's take a closer look at the biggest reality check story of the week, which revolves around Microsoft. And honestly, this one will resonate with anyone who has ever watched an AI project look brilliant right up until finance asked for the actual number. Microsoft is winding down most of its internal Claude Code licenses after opening access to thousands of developers back in December 2025. Experiences plus Devices, the division behind Windows, Microsoft 365, Outlook, Teams and Surface, is now being moved back toward GitHub Copilot CLI by the end of June. The important point is that this does not look like a quality problem. Claude Code had reportedly become popular inside Microsoft. The issue is more about cost, control and standardization. Microsoft is trying to bring developers back toward Copilot CLI as the main agentic command line tool, with Anthropic models still available through that route. So this is not Microsoft declaring that agentic coding has failed. It is Microsoft deciding that unmanaged AI tool spend is not a grown-up way to run an engineering organization. And it is not just Microsoft. Uber reportedly rolled Claude Code out across its roughly 5,000 engineer organization, with adoption jumping from about a third of engineers in February to 84% in March. Then came the awkward bit. The company had already burned through its 2026 Claude Code budget within months. That is where the recent update from Uber COO Andrew McDonald becomes interesting. He said Uber is struggling to draw a clear line between higher token consumption and more useful consumer-facing features. That, to me, is the real phase change. For most of 2025 and early 2026, enterprise AI adoption still had a bit of a land grab mentality. Roll it out, drive usage, prove innovation, sort the economics out later. But this week felt like the moment that stopped working. The real shift is that enterprise AI has stopped being a prestige purchase and started becoming a finance problem. And honestly, that is probably healthier. The companies that get this right will not be the ones that use the most AI. They will be the ones that know where AI is genuinely creating value, where it is just creating token burn, and where a cheaper model or a simpler workflow would do the job perfectly well. So what should you do with that? I'd be looking for three things. First, where are your usage caps and approvals for high burn tools? Second, do you actually know the unit economics by workflow or only the seat count by team? And third, which tasks really need frontier models and which can move to cheaper options without anyone noticing? This episode is sponsored by Notify Technology, a health and safety software partner, helping teams run incident management, audits and inspections, and risk assessments in one place. And with Notify Spark, their AI companion, they're streamlining incident reporting and investigations, saving time, reducing admin load, and helping teams act faster on what matters as AI tools move deeper into day-to-day operations. Learn more at notifytechnology.com. Continuing with Anthropic, but shifting focus from finance to security, there was a significant update on Project Glasswing. Anthropic says its selectively released Mythos model has helped partners find more than 10,000 vulnerabilities in its first month. According to Anthropic's update, that includes high and critical flaws across every major operating system and web browser. In one disclosed run, it scanned 1,000 open source projects and estimated 6,202 high and critical severity issues out of just over 23,000 total. The partner list is what makes this feel real rather than promotional. AWS, Apple, Broadcom, Cisco, CrowdStrike, Google, JP Morgan Chase, the Linux Foundation, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Palo Alto Networks, and roughly 50 partners in all. The awkward bit is that Anthropic says the bottleneck has already shifted from discovery to remediation. In other words, the model can find flaws faster than humans can patch them. That's useful if you're on defense. It's less comforting when you remember that attackers are reading the same trend line. My view is that this is where the cyber story gets more serious. The real issue is remediation speed. If models can surface flaws faster than teams can patch them, defenders start the race already behind. And now, looking at the other side of the same coin, a recent Sysdig report highlights one of the clearest real-world examples yet of an LLM agent being used inside a cyber intrusion. The incident itself happened on the 10th of May, with Sysdig publishing the detailed write-up later in the month, and what they say they captured is striking: their first AI agent-driven intrusion in the wild. The attack began with an exposed Marimo notebook. From there, the intruder moved through cloud credentials, AWS Secrets Manager, an SSH key, a Bastion host, and finally an internal Postgres database. Sysdig says the chain unfolded in around an hour, with the final Bastion to database phase dumping the Postgres schema and full database contents in under 2 minutes. Basically, one exposed notebook gave an attacker a doorway into the company's cloud systems, and within an hour they had followed the trail of secrets and access keys all the way to an internal database, which they copied in minutes. But the really interesting bit is not just the speed, it is the pattern. Sysdig says the command stream looked less like a fixed script and more like an agent adapting as it went. Commands were formatted for machine consumption, values from earlier outputs were carried into later steps. There was even what looked like a leaked planning comment, and crucially, the workflow adapted to an unfamiliar database schema rather than just blindly following a pre-written playbook. Another problem for defenders was that the attacker did not make all their requests from one place. They used 11 different Cloudflare workers' IP addresses to make 12 AWS API calls in just 22 seconds, which makes it much harder for security teams to spot the activity by tracking a single suspicious IP address. This does not mean every attacker has suddenly become a cyber superweapon, but it does mean the barrier to doing serious damage is getting lower. If attackers can automate what happens after they get in, defenders may have far less time to respond than they thought. As Sysdig's Michael Clark put it, attackers are not being replaced by AI, they are replacing scripts with AI. That is the bit that matters. Credential hygiene, egress monitoring, and detection for machine-paced behavior all just became more urgent. Put Glasswing and Sysdig together and the picture is pretty clear. AI is now helping both the locksmith and the burglar. Right, let's rattle through a few more before we wrap up. DeepSeek has now made its V4 Pro pricing impossible to ignore. Its official pricing page lists the model at about 44 cents per million input tokens and 87 cents per million output tokens, with the decoder reporting that DeepSeek has made its earlier 75% discount permanent. That puts serious reasoning and coding capability at a fraction of the price of the main US frontier APIs. And the timing matters, because enterprises are getting much sharper about token economics. If you're buying AI at scale, this gives you a very obvious benchmark to wave around in vendor negotiations. The catch, of course, is governance and geopolitics. Cheap is not the same thing as easy. Anthropic, meanwhile, shipped Claude Opus 4.8 just 6 weeks after 4.7, which tells you how ridiculous the release cadence has become. But the useful claim here is reliability. Anthropic says Opus 4.8 is around 4 times less likely than its predecessor to let flaws in code that it has wrote past without comment. Regular pricing stays flat, and fast mode is now 3 times cheaper than before. So I'd read this as Anthropic trying to answer 2 objections at once. Can these models be trusted more, and can they be made less painful to run? And then there's the labour market backdrop. Tech layoffs in 2026 have now passed 140,000, with some trackers putting the number closer to 150,000. At the same time, the biggest AI platforms are committing enormous sums to compute and data center build-out, with reporting putting 2026 capex from Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet and Meta in the roughly $700 billion to $725 billion range. Recent cuts at companies like Intuit and Coinbase add to the same pattern. Companies are still spending aggressively, but the spending is shifting. Less headcount in some areas, more capital pouring into AI infrastructure. That's what makes this week's funding and infrastructure stories feel slightly more complicated. The money is real, the opportunities are real, but so is the relocation pain underneath it. That's all for this week's AI Roundup. If you found value in this breakdown, please leave a rating and hit subscribe. See you next week.